Hey everybody, welcome to the official Do Good Better podcast. I'm your host, Patrick Kirby, and of course we talk about topics that affect small and medium-sized nonprofits, and I am really excited about today's guest because as you all know, I am a fan of frameworks. I wrote a book about a framework, but I just know how to do fundraising, and sometimes there's leadership qualities that you need to have in framework form, and that's why I have our guest on today. Derik Timmerman. He is the founder and creator of the Nonprofit Leadership Academy. He has some very wonderful insights for you. And by the way, we're super best friends because he is a Final Fantasy role-playing video game nerd. And so I have bonded immediately with him. And I think I'm going to enjoy the show just as much as you guys are audibly. Derik, welcome to the official Do Good Better podcast.
Patrick, thank you so much. Pleasure to be with you.
I'm super excited about today. This is a topic where I think a lot of people towards the end of the year are looking back on themselves and like, how do I develop myself as a nonprofit leader? Are there things I can do in the first part of 2021 or the first part of this quarter that I can really sort of revamp how I lead, how I model my sort of day-to-day activities after. And what you have produced is something radically different than what I've seen in any sort of training whatsoever, and we will get to that. But before, as people are looking through their iTunes and they're looking through YouTube and they're looking through Facebook and they find this as a topic of conversation, there's like, oh, Derik Timmerman, this sounds very much interesting. Derik, kind of tell you who you are, what you do, kind of 5,000-foot view before we dive into this topic.
Yeah, no, it's a pleasure to be with you, and I'm really glad for the opportunity. So, yeah, my background, I have a little bit of a strange kind of Forrest Gump-like background that's brought me to the present time. So, but I'll try to keep it short. So I grew up in Charlotte, North Carolina, and in graduating from high school, decided to try to go big for it with my college experience. So I tried to get into West Point. So ended up going to the United States Military Academy from 1998 to 2002. Your listeners may be doing the math on those years. And yeah, September 11th was my senior year at West Point. So that ended up really changing the outlook of what the next 5 years would be like. Joined as a military intelligence officer and served 2 tours in Iraq. And that's where I really learned a ton about analytics and using data to really try to figure out the best way forward as a unit. And eventually I'd use that in a business context. And that's where I went next. I went straight from the military to a consulting firm called McKinsey & Company. And if your listeners aren't familiar with McKinsey, it's kind of like one of the big strategic management consultancies that sends in teams of 3, 4, 5 people for a few months into Fortune 500 companies and really tries to revamp the whole thing. And this is a project that usually would be for the CFO, the CEO, to do something big in a company. And it's there that I learned a lot of the incredible performance transformation things that are successful in a business context. And after that, went into being an entrepreneur after 6 years at McKinsey, founded some startups. Those are still going. And I've been blessed to see those flourish. So I came kind of to this moment a few years ago when I thought, what is that legacy thing that I just want to leave behind for my kids, for other people, and really for my fellow leaders in the nonprofit world, because I've always had a heart for causes that change the world. And the thing that I landed on was taking all this experience from the military, McKinsey, business, startups, and packaging it into something that could help nonprofit leaders really take that great heart that they have for wonderful impact, but put some real teeth to it in a way that lets them have the impact that their cause and their aspiration deserves. So that's what the Nonprofit Leader Academy really is.
I think it's really fantastic, and I'm going to love this conversation because I think the audience is going to love this sort of framework on a 3-step process. Usually we talk about 5 steps, but so this is totally different and great because it's 3. But one of the things that we talk about with either clients or individuals on the show is the idea of different perspectives. When you have your nonprofit hat on and you are in fundraising mode or you're in marketing mode, you have horse blinders. And so you really think there's only one way to do things. And this is the way that our board has set us up, or this is the way I was taught, or this is the way I think it was, or I read a book about it, or whatever. Having different perspectives, especially from like a management and analytics and a military background, is going to have your brain think differently about how you are managing yourself and your team and your organization. And it's combined with everything else you have in life lessons. I think this is such a great way to bring in another voice, another perspective, another way of doing things so that you can combine it with things that you already know to be a better leader going forward. I really, really, really do appreciate the time. So let's talk about these frameworks. At the Nonprofit Leadership Academy, it's an online course where you can kind of go through at your own pace or at a structured pace, right? With different times and things to do all of your coursework. But if we're just kind of teasing this out and we were talking about coffee, you're going to talk about these kind of things anyway. What are the 3 phases or 3 steps in this framework as you're developing this new sort of leadership mindset at the Nonprofit Leadership Academy?
Sure. Yeah. Well, so the objective of the whole course is to equip nonprofit leaders to maximize the world-changing impact of their organizations. So how do we do that? How do we equip nonprofit leaders to maximize their impact? Mm-hmm. The 3 kind of things that come together to make that possible, and I guess you could call them steps, but really the way we depict the framework is kind of as 3 circles that overlap. And in the middle, you've got this world-changing organization if you can manage to get all 3. And the 3 circles are really, number 1, the impact mindsets and skills. Number 2, impact processes. And number 3, impact measurements. Mindsets, processes, and measurements. And I can go a little bit deeper into what each of those 3 means. But really, whenever I walk into a nonprofit situation in a coaching context and look for what's going right, what's going wrong, usually I can pinpoint that there's 1 or 2 that are a strength for the organization and 1 or 2 that are holding the organization back. So if as a nonprofit, you can get all 3 lined up, you're really in a great place to be a winning, impactful organization.
Yeah, I mean, that's so great. I think everybody can kind of relate to their strengths and weaknesses within, do I have my right brain on? Is my perspective great from a mindset standpoint? Do I have a process in place? A lot of nonprofits don't, or if they do, they're archaic or fumbled together on a bunch of different spreadsheets. And then really the measurements, the analytics piece, which I don't think nonprofits use because they think it's complicated. Or they don't know what those measurements should be, and they're kind of wasting their time measuring things that really have no impact in general, and then they're getting frustrated because either they're hitting them and their numbers aren't right or whatever. So I'd love to take a little bit of a dive into each one of these because I think it's so important, even from a sort of a podcast perspective. How do we reshape our mindset? What are we looking for some positive things? What are some of the processes you found as best practices that people can use? And then really, what are some of the measurements that you've seen out of the gate that are successful regardless of your size or scope or scale, which I think is ultimately, regardless if you're a small nonprofit or a large nonprofit, these are some of the basics of the basics. So let's start with mindset. Why, from your perspective, is mindset, and really what from the military have you seen that is really important? How do you connect those things? Why are the mindsets of a nonprofit leader so important and critical?
Yeah, it's funny, and this is going to be a little bit of a rant, I think, on the nonprofit coaching world too.
Let's do it. Yes.
In a way.
Yes. Let's rage against the machine. Yes, please. Let's rage against.
Okay. All right. So rant begins here. Patrick, I honestly look across the nonprofit coaching landscape, leadership landscape, and it's all jumping straight to fundraising. It's all jumping straight to the outcome. And believe me, when you get to impact measurements, you'll see I am 100% on board with output metrics. I mean, that's where we need to be measuring. But in a course-like environment, to start there and say, this is how you fundraise, this is how you make sure your nonprofit isn't broke. that's the wrong way to go. You've got to start from the very beginning, the roots of the tree. And if you want to grow your tree as tall as you possibly can, those roots have to go super deep. And that's mindsets. It really is. And I see a lot of nonprofits come at their work with a fear-based mindset. And what we try to do in this first module is really transition that from a fear-based mindset where you're kind of chasing every dollar wherever it is. You're trying to be everything to everyone. You're trying to do it all. No, it's focusing on what specifically your value is that you're going to bring as a nonprofit, what the specific problem is you're trying to solve. And we walk the students through a number of questions that help them do that.
It's storytelling. It's getting to the root of your story, which I think is super important. Another thing that I think is really interesting is that that sort of leap to how you're going to fundraise $1 million avoids the real question, which is what's the purpose, and that it's recognizing that it's a long game. That's what I think is really interesting. Is that you can't get from point A to point B without a long, sort of purposeful march towards that goal.
Absolutely.
And if you don't understand that is a long process, you're setting yourself up for absolute failure. And then you get frustrated because you're like, well, I was so positive about all these things, but then you didn't have any of this, like, understanding this is not going to happen right away.
Absolutely right. Yeah, absolutely. And honestly, it really comes down to 4 questions, Patrick, that we take people through. And when it comes to mindsets, that first one is so important. Why do we exist?
Yeah.
Why do we exist? The organization's ultimate guiding statement of purpose. And you notice I'm avoiding these buzzwords like mission and vision, because they're so overused. They really are. You've got to put some content to them. I'm not opposed to the words, but mission, why do we exist? Mm-hmm. The second one is what is winning? You need to define as an organization, what is that win that's a year, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years away? What is winning? And that's the vision. That's that part that says, this is the organization's desired product, outcome, or deliverable. Mm-hmm. That's where a lot of people stop. You have to keep going and ask, who are we when we're winning? Mm-hmm. And that's your values. That's the organization's core characteristics that it commits to uphold at all costs. Who are we when we're winning? And finally, the 4th question is, how do we win? Strategy. That's your plan of action for achieving those desired outcomes. So these are the ways you kind of start to get into what mindsets you need as an organization. Why do we exist? What is winning? Who are we when we're winning? And how do we win?
It's funny because we talk a lot about to sort of frame out these conversations. Sometimes we ask, if you cease to exist, what happens? Mm-hmm. Right? So we're almost role playing down the road. Like, if your organization shuts down tomorrow, what's the impact in your community? Well, if you are forced to be in this, like, if you're losing, do you change what it's like, or do you change your path based on if you're not winning? And does that change your value? And are you abandoning some of those root causes? It's just so, because again, this is where that perspective comes in. This is such a unique way of addressing some of these things. And if you don't answer any of these things, you can't build a process, which, by the way, is the next step. Like, you can't because you have no end goal. And fundraising is always an interesting thing, that there seems to be no end, right? There's always another donor to get. There's always another sponsorship to get. There's always another thing here and there. What's, I think, really important is that that long path has an end game to it, and that is, what's your outcome at the end of the day? I love that. I love those questions you posed at the beginning of this first phase, which is just so interesting and unique. And coming at it from a different angle will allow you to think differently, which thinks creatively, which then puts you into this, okay, maybe we have been doing things right here, but maybe not wrong in this, or not right in this way.
Yeah, and once you're clear on that, Patrick, what it helps you do is really get underneath why you have some of the mindsets that you have that may be holding you back from that mission of why you exist, or that may be holding you back from that definition of winning. There's kind of an exercise that we take people through that lets them look at their behavior and go underneath the surface to see what is the root mindset that's keeping them from doing that thing. So one might be, I don't make time for networking, let's say. So we all know that networking is important for fundraising. I don't make time for networking. Well, that may be because of, just under the surface, you have these thoughts and feelings that you care about people, but you don't feel like networking is as high a priority as operations, financial issues, other things that you could be doing. Okay, so what's underneath that? Well, you may say that networking doesn't help me or others get ahead, and underneath that even is, none of my mentors ever took time to show me networking or the value of it. So there's this underlying thing that you've gone all the way down and found out what is that need that hasn't been met at the root cause of why you don't have this mindset to be a networker, to fundraise. If you didn't do that inner work, you're off trying to implement something for fundraising that you haven't first established the mindsets to be ready for.
It's so good. It's such good information. Now, that alone, if you had 0 steps after that, I think a lot of people would call for, that sounds a little woo-woo-y for me. That sounds a little bit like a self-help book that I don't need, because there's nothing that allows me to have a step-by-step action plan to go along with how do I get from mindset to action, which is why I like your second step, which is a process. Walk us through that, because I think that takes it from, yep, this sounds great, Derik, great. I'm glad I have my mindset right. Now what the hell do I do, right? So to walk us through kind of what the process is, because that I think is so important in this, this framework, is to do.
Yeah. And I'm 100% there with you, honestly, because, this is where kind of my heart for this whole course comes in, is there's lots of well-intended self-helpy type advice out there for nonprofits, but it doesn't really get into the meat of, why great startups flourish and why big companies go from good to great. And that's what the second 2 parts of this are: processes and measurements. And as we get into processes, really, it's important to know kind of the state of play of what's going on in lots of nonprofits right now, the current state, before you go into the future state. And the current state in a lot of nonprofits, I call it either flailing or free soloing. So nonprofits are doing one of these 2 things, right? They're flailing. They're operating in a reactive way to needs as they present themselves. And I think I'm sure not you, but maybe others have started your day and you're just reacting all the way through, with what comes. And you look back and days or weeks or months have gone by and you've just been flailing. The other is free soloing, and that's building systems in a vacuum apart from other entities with similar or complementary missions. So lots of nonprofits, even if they manage to avoid this flailing ditch, they go onto the other side and they create this all singing, all dancing answer in a vacuum apart from what other nonprofits have done to be successful and what their brothers and sisters in the space are doing to cooperate and collaborate with them. So what do we do to avoid flailing and free soloing? Well, it's creating systems. And a system is simply an organized, consistent method for getting the same result every time, no matter who's using the system. I can say it again. It's just an organized, consistent method for getting the same result every time, no matter who is using the system. So what I rely on to teach this is something that's really well known in the for-profit world, not so much in nonprofit world. It's called lean. Have you ever heard of lean, Patrick? Yeah. Oh yeah. So lean is really a way of establishing a continuous improvement culture within any organization. Mm-hmm. And it's basically putting in processes that make sure that you start with something and you get a little bit better every day. Mm-hmm. What lean is big on is, and there's too much to talk about here, but it's reducing waste. Mm-hmm. So you're defining value from the perspective of the end customer. So if it's a homeless shelter, it's that resident that's staying in your homeless shelter. If it's a child care center, an after school care center, it's yes, the child, but really the parents. It's what the parent values in dropping that kid off. So any nonprofit has that customer. And if you're divining value from their perspective and working it back, you can then look at everything you do and assess what is the waste in this that we need to get rid of so that we can focus everything we do, all of our systems, on what brings value to that end customer.
If this sounds familiar to the listeners, is because we talk about this all the time in the fundraising world, which is it's not about your need to have, it's about the donor's need to give. This is the framework in a leadership role that you're looking at the end game. I think a lot of people in the nonprofit world, especially small and medium-sized nonprofits, think of, or they hear the word process, and they think immediately how it's complicated. They can't enact it. We talk all the time. It's 20 minutes a day. It's 40 minutes a day. It's 2 hours a day. It does not have to be this like all-encompassing. It's all you think about. Because if that's all you think about, then you're reacting, which is the problem that you're doing with the flailing, right? So talk us off of a cliff when we just listened to this, and it sounds really good on paper, Derik, but it sounds complicated to do because I don't have 7 team members in order to build a process.
Yeah, no, we in the course use the example of a lemonade stand to really make it absolutely crystal clear. And you think about the system of delivering the lemonade and just that simple. And even every nonprofit, even one that small as a lemonade stand, can develop a system that reduces waste. You start with what you're already doing, obviously, that's the current state. Mm-hmm. You say, okay, the guy pulls up, he gets out of his car, he walks over, he looks at the sign, or he asks you and all the way through this, there's waste. You ask, does him getting out of the car offer him any value? No, it doesn't. So we're getting to the same place all these fast food restaurants got to decades ago with, can I bring the lemonade right to his window? That's actually just getting rid of a waste from the process, giving him exactly the value he needs, and creating a system that does that. You take that across the whole process, everything you do as a nonprofit, and I think a lot of nonprofit leaders would be super surprised at what they can eliminate, what they can remove, if they ask it from that question. If we're just about delivering value and get rid of anything else, what would our system look like? And that's a really fun exercise, and one that any size nonprofit can do.
It's adding by subtracting. Is another thing, right? So what sort of added value are you giving to your donors by eliminating steps in between them trying to understand your mission to give you money, for example, from a fundraising standpoint, and the same thing from a process. That's such a clear example. I so thank you for that, because I think we get into our own heads about what a process is, and then we overcomplicate it, and then we throw our hands up and say, well, screw it, this is going to take too much time and too much work, rather than getting into your own head, your mindsets, by the way, step 1, which is this is going to simplify and sort of bring value to everybody who's a part of our organization, rather than overcomplicating my life by adding things to my life, right?
100%. And honestly, it's really one of the refreshing things about Lean that Toyota started, by the way. This was all, if you wonder why in the 1980s, the Japanese car companies just went crazy, it's because decades before they were implementing this thing called Lean. It's the continuous improvement model that Toyota came up with. Mm-hmm. And their number one tenet for leaders was just to go and see. Like that sounds so simple, but if you want to improve something, if there's an issue with the line, the process, anything, Genshi Genbutsu, go and see. And once you do, you stand there with the people doing the work on the front line, and you figure out the answer to the problem. If you're doing that constantly across all your processes every single day, how are you not going to get 1, 2, 3% better every single day?
If you are sitting behind your computer and you're not actually picking up the phone and you're just scrolling through social media and you are just assuming that money's coming in, you're not going to be a good fundraiser. If you go out and do, and you look at where your impact is and what stories you're having on the front line, you're going to be able to relate to this exponentially. This leads us to benchmarks, and in what you term as impact measurements. This is one of the things that your board of directors and your executive directors are going to look for. But now this is scary. Derik, this is frightening, and I don't know where to start because I don't want to put too, like, we know how successful we are. We're going to be expected to be even more successful, and that scares the hell out of me. Walk me through measurements so that I'm not frightened of this whole third step in this process as part of the Nonprofit Leadership Academy, please.
You're so right. It can be so scary. It absolutely can. I mean, and I think a lot of nonprofit leaders think measurements and they think numbers.
Yeah.
But really that's where I want to really let nonprofit leaders off the hook a little bit, or maybe just make it about something else. Is measurements is not about being a numbers geek. Measurements is about having the right conversations about what matters. So there's three things I recommend that helps nonprofit leaders do exactly that. The first is key performance indicators. And here we go again, right? We're talking about numbers. We're talking about Excel spreadsheets. Yep. Oh my gosh, this is too much. Hopefully this is going to be great news to your listeners. Is when we talk about key performance indicators or KPIs, you're actually not expanding or trying to measure more. You're trying to measure less. You're trying to get down to the 5 to 7 things that your people can measure in real time about what they do to move the needle, that you can constantly measure and improve again and again. It's getting down to those 5 to 7 things that matter most, and just measuring them and having your folks, if you've got a staff, measure them. So that's it. That's the first thing, is key performance indicators. Second is visual management. This is as easy as it gets. You just put a whiteboard up that has like a magnetic whiteboard wherever everyone is passing all the time, and you get those 5 to 7 things up there and you start tracking them, you start writing them down. Mm-hmm. Okay, why a whiteboard? Why not a website or a tool or something? You can move to that eventually, but start rough and ready. Start just completely bare bones so that you can change it. You can get it exactly how you want it. Then maybe you move to an app, then maybe you move to a tool. But one of the key tenets of Lean is keep it rough and changeable until you get to the point where it's working, and then technologize it. Technologize, did you like that? Like, is that?
I feel like we make up words all the time on this podcast, okay. And so this is another one we're going to add to the repertoire. And then just to reiterate your point about about that is a lot of nonprofits let perfection get in the way of progress. I don't have this one-sheeter ready for our organization to have a conversation with a donor. I don't have all the answers. It's okay, right? You're just building up rapport. And if you don't have all the answers and you have to go back to a donor or a funder or a supporter and then go, hey, I don't know anything about that, but let me get back to you. That's another touch point. You're learning on the fly. Like, this is just something we repeat over and over again. And so having those rough and ready, as you put it, pieces to these systems and these measurements is exactly the way to go. Not letting you have everything ready to roll before you go, because yes, you'll never be ready. You'll 100%. This is going to prevent you from going out the door, because you're never going to feel ready until you are, and that's you out in the field doing something.
That's right. That's right. Just get started, and everybody is one trip away from Staples or Home Office Depot or whatever, Walmart, to get this whiteboard and just start today. So that's number 2. The third thing is performance dialogues. I mean, if nonprofit leaders did only those first 2 and established what matters and started putting it up on the wall, things would start to get better. But if you add this third thing about talking about it in a non-judgmental, we're all in this together, arm around the shoulder, we can improve this together kind of way, man, these nonprofits will be absolutely dangerous. You might ask, what is a performance dialogue? There are some that occur all the time. You know, one would just be a very simple start of day or start of shift stand-up meeting, where you're just standing in front of the whiteboard together to start the day, to say, all right, guys, what's the day look like? Quick, 5-10 minutes. But everyone's looking at what matters most right there on the whiteboard and is able to talk about, what do we do today to move the needle? Another would be a weekly all team or all staff meeting. I'm sure there's lots of nonprofit listeners listening that have let's be generous, a less than constructive weekly staff meeting, maybe.
Very generous. That's a very generous phrase.
So yeah, having that weekly staff meeting be about problem solving one, maybe two things, but one main thing as a group that could use some problem solving from, what's going well or what's not going so well on that whiteboard.
Mm-hmm.
And then informal coaching one-on-one, people talking with their volunteers, with their staff, that can benefit from visual management as well. Something I've done in the past is what's called a top 3 card, which is just a little card that people keep in their wallet or on their person, just in their pocket, that has, these are the top 3 things I'm going to focus on this week. And that becomes the coaching rally point for a manager in their direct report, or you as the executive director and your volunteers. Top 3. These are the top 3 things I'm going to work on. And then you get back together, you talk about them. Easy enough. So this is the kind of thing we cover in impact measurements. It's not about numbers as much as it is about really fundamentally changing the way you continuously improve through conversations.
If you haven't gotten a whole heck of a lot of motivation out of this alone, you are either you're perfect, you're a perfect fundraiser, and I don't know why you're listening to this podcast in the first place, or you don't exist as a person, because this is just such great info for your own brain to just let it go. You're gonna be okay. There are steps and processes that are not scary. There are measurements that are going to be beyond that fiscal number that your board has given you that's unrealistic in the first place, to make you and help you feel like you're moving the needle forward down the line. Again, this is so complementary to everything we talk about on the podcast, which is building this process over and over and over again. I just want to make sure that you understand that this is going to be A-okay. And the best way to be A-okay is probably to join the Nonprofit Leadership Academy. How in the hell do we do this, Derik? If we're already bought in, we're sold, this is complementary to everything we talk about and want to be, how on earth do we get access to all of this great information?
Well, yeah, if this conversation's any indicator, I'm less of a kind of a standard guy. So I'm not going to give you the website. I'm actually going to give you instead my Instagram, because what I'd love to do is talk with your listeners that are interested in this. And there's a link right there on our Instagram at Sparrow Solutions. At Sparrow Solutions, there's a link right there to take a free masterclass that gets you more acquainted with some of the things we've talked about here. And then if the Nonprofit Leader Academy is of interest, there's definitely a way to move forward from there. But yeah, please visit us at Sparrow Solutions on our Instagram.
We'll link everything. We'll probably link to your website too, just because we're going to do that anyway in the show notes. But I have, and I personally walked through not only the course, but the masterclass, and have had conversations with Derik behind the scenes even before this podcast. And it's so on par with what we talk about with the 5-day fundraising framework. It is so on par with what our mission is, to serve small and medium-sized nonprofits, to get them to understand that this is not overly complicated. This is not ivory tower, East Coast, big books using big words to explain things that are uncomplicated or overly complicated that you're never going to introduce. These are tangible things that you can do to move the needle forward, and they're so complementary to what we do either at Do Good Better Consulting or the Do Gooders, like the Do Good Better podcast. Like, this is so good. I just want you to go and do it right now. And if you take the masterclass and you don't like it, that's fine. It's totally great, but you need to understand some of these real high-level things that you can go and do right away. I highly recommend it. It's just really good stuff. Derik, you have been a great guest on the official Do Good Better podcast. I'm hoping everybody clicks their way. And we'll probably do this again soon, because I think there's a whole bunch of stuff that we can dive into. And we didn't even talk about nerdy video games, and we'll save that for another podcast anyway. We'll see you back there as well. Derik, thank you so much for being a guest. Sparrow Solutions, go check it out on Instagram first, and then go click to their website right away and go like everything they do on social media. It's great. Thanks for being here.
Patrick, this has been so much fun. Thank you so much, my friend. And honestly, it's great to be a part of a movement of nonprofit leaders and leadership that is really trying to change the game. So I see you as a brother in this cause, and thank you so much for the time to be on the podcast.
Absolutely. Thanks, Derek. I appreciate it. Again, thanks so much for being a guest here on the official Do Good Better podcast.